welcome to the Deschutes Public Library's A Novel Idea presentation on how to make Irish soda bread. In today's video, you will be learning all of the components necessary to make Irish soda bread at your own home. And we'll be highlighting the history, all the necessary tools and ingredients, and the process of how you go about creating Irish soda bread. The inspiration for today's video is taken from When All Is Said by Annie Griffin. And it's a delightful story about an older gentleman in his twilight years who is taking the time to think back on the most inspirational people in his life and give a careful accounting of their incredible contributions to the quality of his life, especially in his golden years. So I highly recommend reading this book. It is a delightful quick read, and it takes you to a time when things are carefully thought out. And today's inspiration to make Irish soda bread finds itself in the fact that Maurice spends a fair amount of time in an Irish pub where he recounts his delightful memories, his thought-provoking, heartfelt times in his life when he really enjoyed all the things that the people that meant most to him shared with him. So, as a tribute to that, Irish soda bread happens to be mentioned a few times throughout the book, and I thought I would take a time to introduce myself and then go through the actual creation of Irish soda bread that you can easily do in your own home. Because the cool thing about Irish soda bread is the fact that you most likely have most, if not all, of the ingredients already in your cupboard or pantry, and you would be able to whip this up in no time at all. So, my name is Elizabeth Guerin, and this is my kitchen because, as we all know, we are in days of quarantining. So I have been making a fair amount of bread, and it was a delight to take on the Irish soda bread for this taping. So I live here in Central Oregon, in Bend. I live with my husband, and we have 3 grown children who also live in Central Oregon. And I have a small little organic farm, and I am a K through 12 foreign language Spanish teacher teaching at an elementary school here in Central Oregon. And so I also happen to teach with Bend Park and Recs District as an enrichment teacher, and I teach bread baking, and I also teach cheese making. So you might want to check that out as well. We have an incredible county which has great resources for us. And well, this was originally scheduled to be both at the Redmond and the Bend libraries. We're going to be in my kitchen because that's where things take place these days. Hopefully you have lots of books to read, and I'm going to encourage you to do some baking as well. So let's talk about what is Irish soda bread and where did it come from? So, Irish soda bread is considered an unleavened bread. There's no yeast involved at all, which I suppose these days is a pretty good thing, knowing the scarcity of yeast. But we take a look at Irish soda bread, and it can be called a peasant type bread. It can be called a quick type bread. It is a rough crusted bread that uses baking soda and baking powder along with buttermilk in order to achieve the rise that you experience with a soda bread. It traditionally has a cross in the top of it, and once you mix the ingredients, there is no rise time required at all. It is all a mix and then put it in the oven for it to rise and bake. It does take a little bit longer to bake than your average quick or peasant bread because it's a fairly dense bread. And so you might choose any one of the variations of Irish soda bread. We're going to go today with a typical Irish soda bread, which has a scant amount of sugar and it has raisins. You may choose to use raisins or you may choose to use currants. Currants are just a smaller dehydrated version of a very similar flavor to the raisins. However, you could choose to omit the raisins, and at times they make a savory Irish soda bread, which does not require any sugar at all. And sometimes they add a caraway to the savory Irish soda bread. So I will demonstrate for you today how to make this Irish soda bread in exactly the same version that I have made earlier today. Let's talk about the history of Irish soda bread and why was it highlighted in this book by Annie Griffin. So let's take a look at that. Well, Irish soda bread's origins happen to be in North America in about 1830, which coincided with the discovery of baking soda as a leavening agent. And it quickly caught on in Ireland because it did not require any yeast and it was a poor man's bread that was quickly put together and baked within a short hour to an hour and 20 minutes total time commitment. So we see that the Irish soda bread is eaten commonly by the Irish, and you'll find it in almost every Irish tavern, I'm told. Just like in America, sometimes you'll find pretzels or peanuts at a tavern. You will easily find Irish soda bread. You will find it at every Irish pub. You will find it on the menu if it isn't just freely offered for everyone. In Ireland, everybody eats Irish soda bread. We know that it's eaten at all times of the day. They eat it for breakfast as toast. They eat it for snack, whether they're having afternoon tea or an afternoon Irish soda bread and some stout or beer. We know that it's eaten with lunch. They typically have Irish soda bread with cheese and fruit. And it's eaten commonly with dinners in Ireland. They tend to like to have it with their soups and stews. And so it is also eaten as a late night snack where people will put their jams or jellies on top of it. They often feed it to people who are not feeling well and they can take something to eat. You'll often be offered some Irish soda bread, or they will soak Irish soda bread in milk and offer it to babies. So it's a very commonly consumed bread, more so there in Ireland and in other parts of Europe than it is here in America. And so when we think of Irish soda bread, we tend to think of it as a poor man's bread because it's eaten with soups or stews and a replacement for some more expensive or convenient snacks. So I hope you're going to enjoy this presentation. I have taken my recipe from allrecipes.com. I'm a fan of allrecipes.com, and I have taken a look at quite a few alternatives. We have many resources available online for choosing an Irish soda bread recipe, but today's recipe comes from allrecipes.com, and I will go through all of the ingredients and the necessary tools that you will need to successfully make your own Irish soda bread at home. So let's begin. Okay. So the first thing you need is a sizable bowl. This recipe calls for 4 cups of flour. And the idea that 4 cups of flour makes 1 loaf of bread should clue you in that it's a significantly sized loaf. You can see here, this is the recipe. It is a good sized loaf for how much they are requiring you to use. 4 cups is a good size. So you could divide this and make this into 2 smaller loaves, but I went ahead and followed the recipe exactly how they stated. And so you can see that this is a sizable, I would call this a definite 2 to 2.5 pound loaf of bread. Okay, so you need a mixing bowl of a decent size. They say large mixing bowl. I would not go smaller than a medium-sized mixing bowl. You need your measuring spoons. You need some measuring cups. It would be helpful to have a pastry blender. It's not necessary. However, a fork can be used in its place, but I find that a pastry blender does a quick job of it. I tend to like using a dough scraper to clean up my work area, and this is a handy device, but optional for sure. We are going to take a look at what our ingredients are based on the recipe from allrecipes.com, and then we're going to get started. So we have flour. I have chosen to use an unbleached white bread flour because that tends to be my go-to flour when I am making any general recipe. In this recipe, you can note that you can alter your flours by adding a portion whole wheat or a portion which would be a nut flour or a coconut flour instead of using all of your all-purpose or bread flour. We have another ingredient. We have buttermilk. Now, this recipe does require buttermilk in specific because the acidic nature of the buttermilk reacts with the baking soda and baking powder in order to give you the desired texture, flavor, and rise in your milk. We are also going to be needing some softened butter. In the recipe from allrecipes.com, it says to use margarine. I think you can use margarine. I think you can use a butter substitute. I tend to like to choose to go with pure butter, and it can be salted or unsalted variety. Bread purists would say unsalted. However, this is a salted variety of butter. Okay. We also need baking soda, baking powder, salt, and the optional raisins. We'll also require us to have an egg. So an egg will be required. We have our own chickens here at our house, so we're fortunate to have ample supply of eggs. Okay. You will also need sugar. In this recipe, I tend to choose organic sugar just because I like to keep it on hand. You don't need very much, and the sugar that is required in the recipe can be exchanged for no sugar, or you can add half the sugar or use a scant amount sugar. Especially if you're going for a more savory bread, then you will probably want to just choose just the slightest bit of sugar and then use your savory seasonings, whether it be caraway or however which direction you wish to go. Okay, so let's get started on our recipe. It does not take very long. It's pretty simple and basic. With your bowl, you're going to take your 4 cups of flour. So we're going to measure out our 4 cups of flour. I buy mine in bulk, and these days I'm glad I've had it. So my 4 cups of flour. To that, according to my recipe, I am going to add my 4 tablespoons of sugar. You can have white sugar. You can use organic sugar. If you choose to use a natural substitute like honey, which you can do, you're going to have to calculate your moisture when you're adding your other liquid ingredients and remove a percentage, a scant percentage, but you're going to have to remove a little bit of your percentage of moisture to account for if you chose to use honey, or some people use malt barley syrup, some people use molasses, so you can use those substitutions. However, I'm going to follow this recipe where I'm adding 4 tablespoons, and mine is a slightly sweet Irish soda bread for this recipe. So I add my 4 tablespoons of sugar. I'm going to add my 1 teaspoon of baking soda, half a teaspoon of salt. I tend to prefer sea salt, but you can use any salt. I would not recommend using coarse salt because that will that could give you a tendency to have pockets of slightly more salt in areas. So I would use a fine grade sea salt or regular iodized salt. It also asks for 1 tablespoon of baking powder. And all of these ingredients, I'm going to, doesn't say to sift them together in this recipe. It just says to mix them well. And I'm taking my pastry blender and I am sifting them, mixing them together fairly well. Does not take a lot. The next thing that I am going to add is my half a cup of softened butter. There's a half a cup measure, and it goes. And this is where your pastry blender tends to really pay off. What you want to do is get to a stage of coarse crumbles. If you've made pie crust before, it is a similar type of texture that you are going for. And you simply use your pastry cutter when you can identify that most of your pieces of softened butter have reduced themselves in size to small peas, then you know you have it fairly well cut in. So I'm just going to move it all around and make sure that I am cut in well. I'm going to take off the excesses, make sure that they also have a place. You can use margarine. You can use other substitutes. You cannot use oil because that adds a liquid component that is hard to account for with the rest of the batter. Okay? So you can see we have kind of a coarse, crumbly type of texture, and texture is what we're looking for. The next thing we want to do is we want to add in 1 cup of buttermilk and 1 egg. Our recipe really doesn't indicate the size egg, so we assume that it is 1 large egg. So we're going to add it right in. It doesn't request that we mix it up, so we add it right in. And 1 cup of buttermilk, my 1 cup measure. Buttermilk is a really cool cultured milk. Always shake it because buttermilk tends to be more liquid on top and more solid on bottom. It's the nature of the product. And we're going to add in our 1 cup of buttermilk. Okay. Now, with our 1 cup of buttermilk and our egg, we have some liquid to work with. And, whoopie-doo, I'm going to grab a spoon. And I'm going to Mix it together. Now, the question you might be thinking is, can I use a mixer or blender or a food processor? And the answer is yes, you absolutely can. In fact, when you read the reviews on allrecipe.com, which is a wonderful aspect of that whole site, is that lots of people use their mixer, stand mixer, or a hand mixer. However, this is a drier type of batter. So you're going to have to do it on pulse just a few times if you're using a food processor, or low and slow for your speed, because you will want to just, what they say is, get the rest of your dry incorporated into your wet ingredients. And so it is a crumbly type of batter that you're working with. It is not a liquid batter in any way, shape, or form. Once you have your batter that is, I would not say stuck together well, but I would say that it has good incorporation of the wet and dry ingredients, I am then going to add my raisins. The amount of raisins has to do with your personal preference and tastes. Some people love raisins. Go for it. Some people won't touch them. You can also use currants. You could go a little bit off tradition, and I know some people who do dried cherries, who do dried blueberries, some people who do dry mango or pineapple, and it kind of takes it up a notch when you're changing out the flavors. Here I have a half a cup of the dark raisins, and I am just going to mix it into my batter. Now, once I have it pretty well incorporated by taking a look at what is dry at the bottom and try to incorporate all of that, I'm then going to knead it by hand. If you had a food processor or a stand mixer, then I would say that can do the work for you. However, in this case, I am going to take my roll pat, which is a baking sheet, and it's a clean surface. I did clean my hands before I started. We always start with washed, fresh, clean hands. And I'm going to take my batter, clean bowl, and you see it doesn't stick together very well, but it will once I start to encourage it with a kneading and incorporating process. So I'm encouraging it to come together, to be in a nice ball shape. And so now I'm going to do just a little bit of kneading. This is not a yeast dough, so the amount of kneading you do is a little bit up to you. According to the directions, it says knead a few times. And kneading is the process of pushing and folding back on itself. We push, we add some energy into it, and what it does is it further brings those ingredients together. Some people absolutely love the process of kneading. Other people run as far away as they can from kneading. And some people tell me, oh, that's their exercise. Well, you could, if you really got into it, you really could get a little bit of a heart rate. But for the purposes of this dough, you can see that it changes with the hand kneading. If you did it in a KitchenAid or a stand mixer, or if you did it in a food processor, you would want to be careful not to overwork your dough. Okay? And so this is a feel thing. This is a texture thing. And so what I am working on is feeling for smoothness. I am wanting it to be cooperative, which it is. It's holding together. It's minding itself. It is keeping its shape. And my kneading is not drying it out. My kneading is taking it to a place where I am happy with the shape, the feel, the texture of it. Okay, so that was all the kneading that I needed to do to know that I am at a texture that I am really happy with. It's smooth, but however, it's not silky smooth like a yeast dough. It's smooth for the type of baking soda and baking powder bread that I need it to be. And so I'm going to encourage its shape by giving it a little, and this is a bread baking tip. You're going to encourage the bottom to hold rather than flatten. And so you can see that I have a carefully formed Irish soda bread. Next thing I need to do is transfer it onto a baking sheet. I'm using a stoneware baking sheet. You can use an aluminum one. You can use a glass cooking pan. Any of those will work for you. I tend to not spray things. I usually always use parchment paper. Parchment paper is designed to handle temperatures and nothing can stick. So I'm going to transfer my Irish soda bread onto my baking sheet. I'm going to turn my oven on, or if I was cooking this moment, I would turn it on 375 degrees and it cooks for 40 to 50 minutes. But I have to tell you that in my personal experience, temperature tells you when it's done. A thicker, heavier loaf like this, a peasant loaf is what bread bakers is what we call it. It really benefits from telling that the internal temperature is 190 degrees. So the recipe says 375 for 40 to 50 minutes. However, everybody's oven is slightly different. Depends if you cook with gas. It depends if you cook with electric. And so you need to know your oven and you need to watch the recipe because it will tell you after 30 minutes, take a really good look at it about every 5 minutes or so. And what you want to do, according to the recipe, is see a nice golden color, and where you have made your slice marks no longer looks that it's raw. However, in my bread baking experiences, 190 degrees is the temperature that tells you your bread is done. So I tend to use my food thermometer just as much as I use the timer on my oven. Okay, so we're just about ready to pop this in the oven, but we have to do our last thing. We have to make a cross on the top because it's not a dough that will rise readily. We're going to make a traditional cross on the top. I can use my dough scraper or a knife. You're going to do a pretty deep cut. If I were to tell you percentages, I would say that your cut in your Irish soda bread is through 20% of your dough. Now, this can go in the oven just as is. However, this recipe says if you are making a sweet Irish soda bread, you're going to want to take a 1/4 cup of butter, and you are going to melt that in your microwave or on your stovetop. Add in a 1/4 cup of buttermilk. Just one moment. Melting. I am melting my butter, and I will add my 1/4 cup of buttermilk to my melted butter, and I'm going to glaze the top. This optional basting will add more color to your finished product. However, some people, we're adding 1/4 cup. I'm taking my pastry brush, mixing up my butter and buttermilk, and I am simply brushing the top and the sections that I have cut a deeper hole into, and I am basting the top to add color and definition to my Irish soda bread. Now, according to our recipe, I have left over, and every 15 minutes, I'm going to open the oven and I'm going to rebaste the top of my Irish soda bread. There's also the suggestion that you might want to optionally just sprinkle a scant amount of sugar to the top. It will add texture, it will add color, and it will add sort of a crunchiness, since my Irish soda bread is more sweet because I use the 4 tablespoons of sugar in my recipe. I feel good about adding a little bit of sugar to the top. Each time you baste with your melted butter and buttermilk, you can go ahead and add just a tiny bit more of sugar to the top. At the end, you probably will have wanted to baste 3 times, possibly 4, but on the last 10 minutes, don't add any more basting to your Irish soda bread. Again, and so I do recommend that you use, this happens to be a digital thermometer, but go ahead and put it right in one of the thicker parts of your bread, and you want it to read 190 degrees, or if you have an analog thermometer, 190 degrees should tell you that your bread is completely finished cooking. Now, while we pop this into the oven, I have people say, well, how long does your Irish soda bread last, and when can I eat it? So, you can eat it right away. However, the rule of thumb with bread baking in general is that there is still more residual cooking going on after you have taken your bread out of the oven. So I recommend you let it rest for 20 to 30 minutes. And then you will still be warm enough to have your butter melt on top of it. But I like for it to rest a minimum of 20 to 30 minutes. Irish soda bread will stay fresh and tasty for you to eat for 3 to 4 days. You would wrap it well in a plastic bag or in plastic wrap. Wrap it tightly. It can stay out for 24 hours, but after that, you should refrigerate it. It does become dry rather quickly just by its nature, but it makes excellent toast. And you can store your Irish soda bread in the freezer for 3 to 4 months, as long as you carefully wrap it. And I suggest double wrapping it in plastic bags, going ahead and labeling what it is and giving a date to it. And you can enjoy your Irish soda bread for up to 3 to 4 months after making it. Well, I hope you enjoyed this session of how to make Irish soda bread, and I highly encourage you to take some time to read the book When All Is Said by Annie Griffin, because it is a charming and delightful book that I'm sure you will enjoy. Thank you for joining me for this edition of A Novel Idea, Baking Irish Soda Bread by Deschutes Public Library.